What happened? The next morning, it was not covered anywhere. No print media, no television media. Not even ABC News covered this story the next morning. Their own program the night before, they didn't cover the story. It was totally squelched. But why was Lloyd so worried? Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples. Lloyd was worried because he had a black lover named Betty Spades. And Betty Spades was a little bit suspicious of old Lloyd, and she thought that maybe he was fooling around with some other women from time to time, so she used to check up on him. So on that Thursday afternoon of April 4th, 1968, she came into the grill looking for Lloyd. And Lloyd wasn't out in the main area of the grill at all, and the kitchen door was closed, and that's suspicious. You know, that kitchen door is not supposed to be closed. So she goes and she opens the kitchen door, and she walks into the kitchen. Nobody's around, but the door leading out into the bushes in the back is open. Now that's not the way it's supposed to be either. That's supposed to be closed. Outside door. As she approaches that door, she says, maybe Lloyd's out there fooling around the bushes with some of these local women. Right? As she approaches that door, she hears a shot. And she stops. And then she continues, and she gets up to the door, and she looks out into the area of the bushes, and what does she see? She sees old Lloyd running, carrying a still smoking rifle. He brushes past her. His knees are covered with mud. His face is white as a ghost. He's out of breath. He rushes in, bends down and starts to break the rifle down, takes out the cartridge, and says to her, "You wouldn't do anything to hurt me, Betty, would you?" And she said, "No, Lloyd, of course not." Throws the cartridge in the toilet, stops it up, covers the rifle with a cloth and takes it out and puts it under the counter in the grill, where taxi driver James McCraw would be shown it sometime later, totally separate from Betty. Well, Betty kept that story from 1968 to April 1968 to December 1992 when she told it to me finally. Some of these people I had known for 15, 20 years before, as it would turn out, before they would eventually come out with their stories. And some of them had held these stories for, 30 years or so. They just held on to them, and they were afraid. They didn't talk. And if no one had been around, I suppose, to eventually listen when they were ready, then they would take them to their graves. But that's what has made this case really different than any other assassination case in history. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So, Lloyd Jowers then was a critical guy in this whole scenario. And his story basically was this. He was approached by a man called Frank Liberto, who was an associate of Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans crime boss. The Marcello family had taken a contract on the killing on Martin Luther King. Marcello gave the contract to Liberto, subbed it out. Liberto came to Jowers, whom he knew, and he said, "We'll give you $100,000, plus I'll forgive an old debt that you have." And I eventually found out what that debt was. And you must help us with arranging this assassination. So Lloyd's place was used for the planning and the logistics of the assassination, and his job was really to hold the gun, the actual murder weapon, for a period of time during the day, turn it over to the people who were giving it to the shooter, and then take it back from the shooter and hold on to it and eventually dispose of it. So that was Lloyd's role. And the money came out of New Orleans. It was delivered to him in a vegetable box from one of the, actually not Liberto's warehouse, but another produce dealer. So that was Lloyd's story. In '78, when I first went into Memphis, I saw a man called Johnny McFerrin, one of the bravest men I've ever met. Johnny was a civil rights leader in Fayette County, black guy, still owns a garage and a little store out in Somerville, Tennessee, in Fayette County, which is the most racist by far of any county in Tennessee. Johnny's been shot at, beaten up, bones broken, hospitalized more times, attempted to be poisoned, you can imagine. Not just because of the King case, but because he led voting rights demonstrations and registration drives in Fayette County for black people. When I went to see Johnny McFerrin, he agreed to see me because Reverend James Lawson asked him to talk to me. And Lawson was Martin's best friend in Memphis. I met him, the night I met him, his windows had been shot out in his garage, and he had the duct tape. He taped them up again. And we met in the back room of his garage with the lights out, and we sat in chairs like these, about 6-8 feet apart, and he sat with a rifle between his legs the whole time. Other times when we continued the meetings, he insisted on meeting in a moving car. Wouldn't stay still in any one place. John told this story. On the day of the killing, he was in Frank Liberto's warehouse, produce place, getting produce items for his store and pulling them off the shelf as he always did, and he'd go and he'd pay for them on the way out. He helped himself. And as he was pulling these various items off and filling his basket, he heard Liberto on the telephone. And Liberto was speaking in a very loud and angry voice, so he could hear him clearly, and he heard him say, "Shoot the son of a bitch when he comes on the balcony. And don't bring your ass around here and get down in New Orleans and pick up the rest of your money from my brother." Now, John knew Liberto was mob connected, so he thought it was something to do with him. It was only an hour later when he got back up to Somerville and he heard about Martin King being shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel that he realized what he had heard. So he eventually was convinced a few days later to tell his story to the Memphis Police Department detectives and the FBI, and they tried continually to break his story, change his story, and they couldn't. And he stuck with it from that day to this, and this is what he heard, and this is what he said. And I had heard that early on in '78. So years later, after the television trial, when Jowers was put in such a situation that he had to effectively tell us what he knew, it all sort of came together. After the television trial in '93, in March 20th or 21st, I think, there was an article in the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper which brought in a whole other perspective that I never even dreamed of, and most Americans will be horrified about. That was the perspective that Steve Tompkins wrote about when he traced the infiltration of civil rights activists and movement leaders going back to the second decade of the 20th century after the Russian Revolution. At that point in time, the army believed that black people were natural recruitment targets for the Communist Party. And the Russian Revolution triggered extensive surveillance and monitoring of black community leaders all over America, including the family of Martin Luther King, Julian Bond, and others who were leaders in their communities. Steve took that story all the way through to Quantal-Pro in the 50s and the 60s, but in his article there was one little paragraph that caught my eye, and it said that there was in Memphis, he didn't know anything really about the assassination, but he said there was in Memphis, Tennessee on the 4th of April an Alpha 184 sniper unit, and nobody has ever explained why they were there. Now, that's all he said. So I went to see him, and I said, there was this unit. He said, yes, they were there. And you know who they were? And he says, yes, I know who they were. And you know what they were doing there? And he says, I know what they were supposed to be doing there. And I said, will you get me access to some of the members of that unit? And he said, they'll never talk to you. Will you talk to them and because they'll trust you, because you know them already and you haven't betrayed them, take questions from them? He said, no. He kept saying no. Finally he said yes. And then this whole other dimension of the story came out, and we started to get this information about the unit. What they were was, they were a specialized assassinations team. They were special forces all Vietnam experienced. 2 snipers and 2 spotters were the integral parts of the unit. They came out of Camp Shelby, Mississippi. They had a briefing at 4:30 a.m. in the morning. At that 4:30 a.m. morning briefing on April 4th, 1968, they were shown 2 photographs. One of Martin King and one of Andrew Young. And these were their targets. And they were to go to Memphis, Tennessee and take up prearranged positions from rooftop buildings. And on orders, they were to kill. They were to shoot Martin King and Andrew Young. And that was as simple as that. The briefing was over at 5, and they headed up toward Memphis. They took up their positions in the morning, and they stayed there all day.